discussion
Just
of...
come forward.
Yeah, let's not smell the egg. God knows what will fall on us.
Two papers that had a lot of resonance, I think, with each other in relation to what we might think of. I was thinking, listening to Nikos's paper about another framework, that the Melanie Klein's framework of reparative versus paranoid positions.
Right.
Both papers seem to be thinking about a dialectic between those two positions taken by states, nation states in relation to kind of national, cultural, others. So no doubt it's very rich terrain for discussion. Yes?
I didn't expect this afternoon. I guess once you're a refugee, you remain a refugee. I am a refugee.
Mm-hmm.
I was born on January 21st, 1933 in Mülheim, Germany. There's no linking there of the fact that Hitler was elected chancellor 10 days after I was born. I must say I was not responsible. But I've been asked at my right age, I've been asking a lot of questions, mainly because we were kicked out of Germany. The German Jews thought nothing would happen to them. And then I was kicked out of Holland because the Dutch were going to send us back to Germany. Then my family, some went to Shanghai, where they lived during the war, and my grandmother died there. And the question that I grapple with all the time is, where was the opposition? We're framing it in terms of our particular interest. Where was their media opposition? And where we're at right now in the United States is really very scary, because there isn't really an opposition voice that I can find, the voice of the refugee. And I'm not sure what my question is. I guess it is, how do we respond? Is the question for me right now. I'm safe and sound, and I have a family, although my family, my sons are in, one of my sons and my grandchildren are in Turkey, and they're threatened there by the far right. So what do we do? How do we fight back? Sorry for being long-winded.
What happens at these times, unfortunately, is media propagate common sense, but not good sense. That's what happened in Germany. That is what's happening in various parts of the world, unfortunately. I guess, it is of course impossible to come up with a formula, but obviously to state the obvious. Yes, we need voice, we need more voice for refugees. These initiatives I mentioned, activist groups, artist groups, are trying to do so, but of course we need those on larger scale. They are great initiatives, and media need to pick up on those and put those to the fore. But that's a representation thing. What it starts and ends with is political decision making and governmental policies to deal with these issues effectively, I would say.
I hear perplexity in your voice, Carrie, and I share it. And just to exchange biographical, I was born here in Melbourne. My mother was born in Greece. Her mother was born in Turkey. And in 1923, the priest in her village stood up and said, "Brothers, sisters, children, let's go home." Well, actually, the Greeks of Trabzon migrated from southwest Turkey 2,500 years earlier, but whether they were transported to was northwest Macedonia.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law was born in Shanghai, of German family, 1939. Her father said, "Let's go home." What a mistake that was. Took 2.5 weeks. In the meantime, Germany had gone to war by the time they crossed the Trans-Siberian Railway. So these stories are probably not unfamiliar to you.
No.
And our paths seem to have crisscrossed through the generations. But the perplexity that I hear is also a philosophical one in terms of opposition, which is to do with the question, why is the discourse of hate so powerful? Why is the discourse of territory so compelling? Why is the discourse of fearing the other so potent? And the perplexity for me revolves around one very fundamental axiom in those propositions, which is articulated very explicitly in Sloterdijk. In order for me to feel connection, love, and sympathy and bonding with the other, they must be proximate to me, they must be similar to me. In other words, if I have face-to-face relations with you, I've developed social bonds. So love and care and concern and solidarity requires intimacy. But hate seems to grow with distance. The further you are from me, the more remote you are to me, the less contact I have of you, the more powerful my hate towards you seems to be. And this has been demonstrated in so many surveys. The parts of the UK where the fear of being swamped that is most extreme, I mean, in surveys that show that 85% of the people of Peterborough or Suffolk feel that they're being swamped by refugees, they're the ones with the least numbers. So there seems to be this profound disconnect between a capacity to fantasize fear and our lived experience of care. So I don't know the answer to that, but I'm certainly as perplexed as you are, and it's disturbing that somebody a little bit older than me, but not much, it still hasn't got the answer.
Maybe by tomorrow.
Right. We've got a few questions. We might gather them up. So can we go Justin, then Scott had one, and then up the back there, and then Audrey. So that's 4. If we just get those 4 questions, and then number 5, and then maybe we'll do a kind of cumulative response if you can remember the questions to
Yeah, it's just, I don't suppose anybody in the audience today would be defending Sloterdijk after your portrait of him, and I've only read one of his books, so I'm not disputing it. But it seems to me there's this other story there that you've kind of you've set up a bit of a straw man in that way. Because, you know, what you say about first order and second order, very interesting. But I could show you, and I'm thinking of our Chinese colleagues, the debate between legalism and Mencius, we call it, Mensa, you know, in, what is it, 400 BC, when that debate, is this, are humans naturally compassionate, or must they force to be compassionate by law? I mean, that's been a huge debate in ancient China and at many other places. And the response, the kind of Confucian's response was, well, we are naturally compassionate, but we must be trained thereby, you know, through ritual and things like that. And of course, the origins of aesthetics, we heard a bit about this morning, come out of a kind of post-Hobbesian debate when, you know, do we hold society together by an absolute sovereign, or do we bring people to kind of will, you know, all that kind of thing. And this, the Sloterdijk, I think he's in that space. I don't agree with his answer, certainly, but what he said, where is the place? Because we do need a place. We cannot be absolutely open to the world. We will be washed away in nothing. That's a basic biological thing. There's an inside and outside. We're now in a world where a new kind of, you know, what new kind of belonging, what new kind of placemaking can take place after national boundaries, and it's a really big issue. So what Sloterdijk's asking surely is, where is that sense of culture that allows us to make sense of place, that allows us to train, he uses that word training, to train people to be good and compassionate. Where is that space? And I think he's putting his finger on something much more interesting than, you know, as a spokesperson, as he is for a kind of conservative German nationalism.
Scott, you had a question.
Yeah, I mean, following what Justin's saying, that's sort of, I think, the space that Sennett's talking about too, when he's talking about the need for, I'm thinking of the recent book you wrote together, where he's talking about the need for some kind of social cooperation. How do you evolve social cooperation between people who aren't equal, who don't like each other, who don't really know each other? You know, this is problematic. And that's where he's talking about that idea of social skill. And so the question that I would be putting to Nikos, which is a nice short one, you know, you're saying perhaps responding with reason is inadequate. Maybe how do we respond aesthetically? What might that take? And I was really struck in Miyase's presentation by all the media examples you had about, you know, reporting the oncoming wars, whether they were formal media or whether they were photographs of people protesting. And I think one of the, you know, I was talking this morning about social media platforms and capacity for public organisation, and of course that can take many different forms, you know. And one of the characteristics we're seeing now is the spread of so-called fake media stories. So it's not a phenomenon now of arguing. You know, Nikos was making the point about actually the reality in Australia on all kinds of measures is that multiculturalism has succeeded, it's embedded, and yet the rhetoric is that we're in trouble, we're under threat, we've got to, you know, block the borders, stop people coming in, and all that sort of thing. And I think one of the questions we're facing, perhaps this is part of that perplexity, is, well, what are the responses? Because the traditional responses would be, how do you control social media through, you know, editorial functions or through government or something? But I don't think either of those responses are very progressive or practical responses. And in the end, what we're talking about perhaps is evolving new kinds of collective responses, but that is a very slow and painful process. So anyway, that was the space I was wanting to raise there.
Right, and then, yeah.
It sort of relates these things through to possibly that image. Before that image went up, like I had sort of this this thought that sort of connected the two previous presentations. Really, the idea that, or maybe not the idea, but the potential that there is that, you know, that large geopolitical kind of strategy of utilizing, like weaponizing those refugees to fracture Europe, to actually cause a pretty much that situation. Like it's a kind of a Caesarean birth of something that can never be born, like, because it's actually we're constantly kept in a state of infantilized, or, you know, or like an infancy, and supplied. It's the amniotic fluid is like now digital, you know, like we're never actually even given the potential to become, you know, to fully come into the world. But the new man, the Soviet, and I think that is probably the Soviet man, like that was actually being described there, and the idea of the externalization of the soul into technology, that was kind of the, you know, really the kind of structure of, or the initial intention of scientific socialism. I think we're kind of seeing that actually playing out now as we move into a, you know, well, you know, nothing less than a technological superstate that has to ultimately give way to all those kind of boundary conditions of all the regional governing states. But and maybe I'm just speaking from the paranoid position and somehow.
Okay, I think my question also relates to all the other questions, but more for Miyase in the context of methods, right? So I am keen to hear more about your methodological intervention, if you like. How do you actually operationalize cosmopolitanism, right? So how so in other words, people talk about, you know, there has to be another way, another perspective, you know, so and if this kind of mediation of public stories, if you like, you know, opens out a way to enact cosmopolitanism, if you like, then, you know, sort of what are the kind of indicators of that? How do you actually operationalize that? So in your talk, it's you know, sort of sort of around a kind of media sociology of media stories, media representations, and then into the industrial kind of operations of media practices. But how do we know that that is actually, you know, sort of successfully impacting, you know, the engagement with the other, right? So so maybe just to kind of a bit of a background, the kind of project that Nikos was talking about that we were involved in, also, and what Scott was saying, that we found that, you know, multiculturalism rhetorically is, you know, kind of being put down by the government, but in the everyday context is very much alive. So from that perspective, so we started to speculate. So maybe there is a way to think about a new form of citizenship, and in our project we call that cultural citizenship. And I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with that concept, but in most of the writings around that concept, it's always very abstract, very speculative, it's very theoretical. So we wanted to find a way to sort of operationalize that, to kind of produce new, how do we measure if someone says that there are new claims to cultural citizenship and, sort of refugees or migrants, have access to arts and culture in our project, for example, how do we actually, sort of measure, what are some of the kind of terms and conditions by which we then say, yes, if they meet all these criteria, then, the social contract in a way is sort of successul, right? So I'm not sure if I'm being clear, but, so maybe you can talk a little bit more about the kind of operationalizing part of cosmopolitanism in the work.
Okay, yes, all right. Well, let's have a quick one here and then down.
I'll say a quick one.
Yeah. Two quick ones. Yeah.
Multiple issues have been raised by different researchers on public space. I wonder whether there is a need for a universal definition for a public place, a public space for the purpose of doing research.
Actually, going along with that, I wanted to bring this back to public space, and I'm wondering if public space is really where we see or are exposed to the other, and whether public space provides the opportunity to kind of counter the media frames of the invasion, or reaffirms it. I think it's harder to feel threatened or to hate somebody who has a name, who you see every day, who you encounter. And so the rise of the far right might be an urban phenomenon, where in the United States we've been, I think, as a defense, we've been saying that it's the rise of the rural, not the urban, that gave us Trump. And yet, perhaps it is the anonymity of the urban that allows for the rise of the far right. And I'm wondering if some of the issues associated with urban and public space might be brought to bear to understand the rise of the far right throughout the world.
So no, maybe yes.
Let's walk off a little bit.
So would you like to sort of go one then the other, going through those questions, perhaps?
After you.
I can start with the last one and say a few words, maybe you want to chip in relation to, well, first of all, Trump's supporters, they were not actually uneducated. The first reaction was, oh, these are, they were actually, many of them were highly educated, urban. Of course, it is impossible to say the rise of the far right is an urban phenomenon, but they basically, of course, capitalize on that, and the fact that, as I noted in my talk, we're losing cities like either London, Stockholm, we're losing our identity. That kind of discourse is very much used and manipulated by the far right, but it's not exclusively an urban phenomenon, obviously. But there is a disconnect. I can speak for Sweden, or use Sweden as an example, in terms of Sweden's national self-image, the national discourses, openness, inclusiveness, and how segregated its cities are. It's one of the most segregated urban landscapes is in Sweden, actually. Stockholm and other big cities. Malmö is actually more multicultural, a little more connected than other cities.
Malmö?
It has a big migrant population, but compared to Stockholm and Gothenburg, it is more multicultural, I would say. At least you see migrants in the city center, unlike in Stockholm. In inner city, you see international white-collar people as migrants or students, but not really migrants. They're very much outside of the city in suburban areas.
in light of this rural-urban thing, there's a nice little point. In ancient Greece, when the people would meet at the Pnika, where the deliberative space outside of the agora was where they would meet to discuss. Every citizen had the right to speak, to address the assembly. And the assembly could include everything up to 10,000 people on this hill. And there was a step called the Vima, where you stood on to make your speech. When the Democrats were in power, the step faced the sea. There was an open horizon behind them. When the oligarchs were in power, the step faced the mountain. I'm agricultural in origin, but my disposition is seafaring. But that's just a cute little anecdote, perhaps. But coming back to Justin's point about Schlotterbeck, I, like you, I imagine, Justin, I'm interested in the problematic he puts his finger on, but I certainly don't defend his solution. And you're right, he does identify a phenomenally interesting problem about how we make sense of the abilities and capacities for coexistence, sharing, cooperation, reparative forms rather than necessarily falling into this paranoid schizoid position, which I think he does fall into. But the issue here is, in order to address this, we could spend time saying, am I going to address this purely in a normative discourse? Am I going to make my argument based on evidence and reason, argumentation? And as a society in Australia, during the Tampa debates in the early 2000s, every church leader, every academic, every ethnic spokesperson, every head of every medical organisation in this country spoke in one voice about the harm and disgrace and the economic waste and the political illegality and the moral crime being perpetrated around the refugee policies. On all those issues, they presented a reasoned, rational position, to which John Howard and then the rest of his party thumped their hands and continued thumping their hands and their fists on the desks and said, "You're just a bunch of out-of-touch elites." So much for reasoned argument. Since that time, I've been saying it's not that that reasoned argument no longer has a place. Obviously, I work at a university. I don't talk myself out of a job, but I don't think it is sufficient in and of itself to win the day. And therefore, we need to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how we also need to communicate and have a discourse for the other positions, the other forces, because reason is one kind of force, violence is another kind of force, but so is aesthetic power that has its force too. So how do we find a voice for that kind of force? And as Audrey has intimated and already articulated, we found that in fact, in the everyday life examples that we've investigated of multiculturalism, it's alive and kicking. As Scott says, it's a success story. Now, if we know this on an everyday level, why is there a discourse at the federal level that has purchase in our political discourse? It has purchase because it appeals, I suspect, to this fantasy of place and this primacy of selfhood. But what is interesting to me is that people have a capacity, like in the Confucian system that you set up, to show care and compassion independently, because the people we interview are not graduates of moral philosophy, right? The people we interview are not simply card-carrying members of the Liberal Party, but they are victims of that discourse. So the political discourse and the philosophical so-called protection mechanisms are not in place. So how is it that they have the capacity then to actually get on and coexist and find ways to creatively actually live together and produce new things and develop new kinds of networks which completely elude, bypass and exceed the categories of the national debate?
Could I just one comment, which has not been dealt with in terms of looking at media. The reality of Trump is, and of Hitler, if you read Speer, is that the far right was the media and the far right was much more entertaining than the left.
And they dress better.
Huh?
And they dress better.
And they may have dressed better, but you were mesmerized by Trump.
Yeah, the performance.
And here the media didn't do their job. He was right in that sense. But there was an entertainment factor. There was an entertainment factor with the rise of the German Reich. And we don't address
So
that.
there's an aesthetic issue. That's what you're saying, is that?
Spectacle.
Spectacle.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, they're very much responsible, the media. The head of CBS said Trump is not good for the nation, but it's good for CBS. And they gave him so much media space.
Yes.
So they are very much responsible. And to go back to the methodology question, it's a tough one, of course. We're not the only ones, obviously, who try to, it's an attempt on our part to try to sort of link it to empirical studies, but we are not measuring whether these individuals or these practices or initiatives are cosmopolitan or not. But if we take cosmopolitanism to mean acceptance of the other without necessarily seeking consensus, if we use that as a very sort of basic definition of cosmopolitanism, what we were looking at was how different individuals and communities, we looked at different fractions of inner city, middle class people, migrants, rural area people who live in rural areas, how they operate in that landscape being dominated by one, virtual encounters, mediated encounters, which do provide a cosmopolitanized, at least, space, and also their actual everyday physical encounters. And of course, oftentimes cosmopolitanization comes with encapsulation at the same time. So there is very much a tension field. So there are connects and disconnects in people's understandings, their inclinations, orientations, ethical orientations, value orientations, and actual practices. So that's what we were looking at, and that's what I mean that we were trying to give empirical backbone to cosmopolitan understanding of media and everyday practices, but not measuring whether they're cosmopolitan or not. That would be meaningless, I would think.
I think we might be. Is it super quick?
No,
Like we should
Bring it on down.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
Save it for the last session.
Save it for the last session.
We've got
All
like
right.
15 minutes for coffee. And then
Yeah,
we'll
you're
go
right.
on
All
the
right.
session.
Well, with that,
Hold that thought.
thanks to the presenters and all of the people who were engaged in that very riveting discussion. Thanks, and let's go to afternoon tea. Thank you.